My name is Bryn Ingram, and I was 34 the winter my parents left me a broken cabin while they handed my brother a $2 million house. The lawyer read it out loud at a long table. Dale got the mansion in Miami. I got a shack 150 miles north of anywhere, the kind of place nobody drives to on purpose. My fiancé sat beside me, and by the end of that week he'd called me a pathetic loser and walked out the door. So I drove a snow machine north to a cabin nobody wanted. What I pried out from under the floorboards was worth $500 million. And that was the night the real trouble started, because my dad never did a single thing without a reason. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where ordinary women face the people who underestimated them and answer not with shouting, but with the truth, the paperwork, and a spine that won't bend. If quiet justice is your kind of story, drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. It started in October, with my parents acting like nothing was strange at all. My dad called me on a Tuesday and said they were going to spend the winter on the land up in the Kobuk country, where his people came from. No phone, no radio checks, just the two of them, a cabin, and the dark coming down early. I wasn't worried. That was the thing about my father. Sam Ingram could disappear into a frozen valley for months and come back fatter and happier than when he left. He grew up out there. He taught me how to read snow the way other dads taught their kids to read a clock. My mother went with him every few years, and every few years they came home in spring with stories. So when the first snow buried Caribou Bend, I let it go. I ran my survey business out of a one-room office on Main Street and waited the way I always waited. But October became December. December turned into a January so cold the creek behind my house groaned all night like something alive. I caught myself standing at the window, smelling wood smoke and spruce that wasn't there, the smell of his cabin when I was small. I told myself the quiet was normal. I almost believed it. Then, the second week of March, a letter came from a Fairbanks attorney named Hannah Brower, and the envelope was thick enough to scare me before I opened it. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time before I broke the seal. Some part of me already knew that whatever was inside, my easy winter of pretending was over. Hannah Brower's letter didn't say my parents were dead. It said something worse, in a way. It said nobody knew. I called her office the next morning and she explained it carefully, like a woman used to delivering bad news to people who weren't ready. My parents had set up a living trust years before, and they hadn't left the hard part to chance. They had pre-signed the transfer documents themselves, deeds and assignments, notarized, sitting in a file in Hannah's office, with written instructions that if they went out of communication past April 1st and no one could confirm they were alive, she was to deliver and record exactly what they had already signed. So it's their signatures doing this, not your call? I said. Their signatures, their instructions, their condition? She said. I don't have discretion, Ms. Ingram. I'm holding paper they executed with their own hands. They built it that way on purpose. I asked her to wait. I told her my dad had vanished into the bush a dozen times and walked out every spring. I said April 1st meant nothing out there. She was quiet, then said the words I'd come to hate. The instrument doesn't bend, and I can't make it. I asked to see the file. I asked who'd witnessed it, who'd drafted it, whether I could challenge the timing. She let me ask all of it, then said quietly that a person is allowed to set conditions on their own property, that the signatures were clean and properly witnessed, and that fighting my own parents' signed instructions would face a steep climb in any Alaska court. Then she told me the plan would be read aloud to the whole family because my parents had wanted it that way, witnessed, in a room, with everyone watching. I should have felt relief that there were rules at all. Instead, I felt the floor tilt. My father planned everything down to the grain of the wood. If he'd written a clause that could only hurt the people he loved, then he'd meant for it to hurt, or he'd meant for it to mean something. I just couldn't see which yet. The reading happened in Fairbanks, in a conference room with bad carpet and worse coffee. Dale flew up from Miami in a coat too thin for the cold, his wife Vivian beside him in sunglasses she didn't take off indoors. My brother is 7 years older than me and has spent every one of those years certain he's the one who got it right. He left Alaska at 19. He flips houses in Florida, or did, before the market ate him. Marcus came with me, my fiancé then, holding my hand like a man who already had 1 foot out the door. Hannah read it plainly. To Dale. The Miami property, valued at $2.2 million, free and clear. To me, the cabin in the Kobuk drainage and the section of land surrounding it. That was all. A shack, and the snow around it. Dale actually laughed. Not cruel, just relieved, like a man who'd bet right. Vivian's shoulders dropped 2 inches. I sat very still and counted the squares in the carpet. There must be more, Marcus said. There wasn't. Hannah slid the folders across the table, 1 fat, 1 thin, and the thin one was mine. Dale leaned back and folded his hands behind his head. Don't look like that, Bryn, he said, almost kindly. Dad gave me Miami. He gave you a shack. That tells you everything. I didn't answer him. I'd learned a long time ago that the loudest thing in any room can be a woman who refuses to perform her own heartbreak. But the words stuck in me like a splinter, and I knew they'd be there for weeks. Because here's the part Dale never considered. Sitting there grinning at his fortune, my father had spent 50 years teaching me that the things people throw away are usually the things they were too small to understand. Marcus didn't say much on the drive back to his place in Fairbanks. He waited until we were inside, until the door was shut, and the heat was ticking in the vents. Then it came out of him like he'd been holding it for years. He had a development deal stalled out. A strip of lots near the river. Permits dead in the water. A bank breathing down his neck. He'd been counting on what I'd inherit to float it. I stood in his kitchen and watched a man I'd loved for 2 years rearrange his whole face in front of me. I don't get it, he kept saying. How do they leave you nothing? I told him a cabin wasn't nothing. He laughed, and it wasn't the good kind. It's a frozen box of rot, Bryn. It's worthless, like. And he stopped. But I watched him decide to say it anyway. You're a pathetic loser, Bryn. A frozen shack is exactly what you deserve. I didn't cry. I want you to hear that, because everyone expects the woman to cry. I took the ring off my finger, set it on his counter, and let the small click of it be the only thing I said. He told me I'd regret this. He told me I'd come crawling back. I put on my coat. In my pocket, my fingers found my father's brass compass, the one he'd given me when I made my first survey on my own, and the cold weight of it steadied my hand. I drove the 4 hours home to Caribou Bend through black ice and didn't turn the radio on once. By the time I reached my own door, I'd stopped feeling the insult. I'd started planning. I was going to go see that worthless shack with my own 2 eyes. People think the worst moment is when someone you love calls you worthless. It isn't. The worst moment is wondering if they might be right, and choosing to go find out for yourself anyway. I packed a week of supplies and pointed the snow machine north. If you've ever had to go look the truth in the eye alone, you already know this exact feeling. Stay with me. This is where it turns. You don't just drive to my father's cabin. You fly a bush plane to a gravel strip that isn't on most maps, and then you ride 40 miles of frozen country on a snow machine, and then you hope. I chartered a pilot named Cale out of Bettles who'd flown my dad for 30 years. He didn't ask why I was going. Bush pilots learn early that grief and stubbornness look the same from the cockpit. He set me down on the strip, helped me unload the sled, and told me weather was coming in 2 days. "You'll want to be off this ground before it does," he said. I told him I would. The first 20 miles were easy, hard-packed and bright. Then the wind found me. Snow lifted off the ground in sheets and erased the horizon, and I rode the last stretch by feel, and by the line of stunted spruce my father had taught me to follow when I was 12. My hands went numb inside 2 pairs of gloves, my goggles iced over. I did not panic, because panic is a luxury you can't afford 40 miles from the nearest human being. I dropped my speed, found the creek, and followed its frozen spine the way he showed me, the ice cracking and settling beneath the machine like the land clearing its throat. And then, through the blow, I saw it. The cabin sat low against a stand of black spruce, small and leaning, exactly the worthless shack everyone had promised me. But the roof was sound. The shutters were tight. The woodpile was stacked high and squared off with a care that stopped me cold. A man doesn't keep a worthless thing like that. I cut the engine, and the silence came down like a held breath. Inside, the cabin was colder than the air outside, the way empty buildings always are. I got a fire going in the old barrel stove and stood over it until my fingers came back. Then I looked around, and the looking changed something in me. This was not the cabin of a man who'd abandoned a place. His wool coat hung on a peg by the door, brushed clean. A row of survey texts stood on a shelf, spines unbroken, dust wiped. Maps covered one whole wall, pinned in neat overlapping squares, the kind of careful work I do for clients who pay me well. The smell hit me last. Wood smoke and spruce. The exact smell I'd been chasing at my own window all winter, and it folded my knees a little. I sat on the edge of his bunk and let it come. My father had not left this place to rot. He'd kept it like a church. I made tea on the stove and walked the room slow, the way I walk a parcel before I survey it, reading the ground for what it's trying to tell me. The floor was hand-planed plank, tight and level, and a man who built a floor like that doesn't tolerate a soft spot. So when one board near the bunk gave under my boot with a hollow, wrong note, I stopped. I shifted my weight back and forth and felt it flex, felt the empty space sing underneath. Everywhere else the floor was solid as bedrock. Here, one plank sat loose over a hole my father had cut and hidden on purpose. I crouched down and ran my thumb along the seam, and my heart started going hard and slow. Whatever was under there, he'd wanted it found by someone willing to come this far. I didn't pry it up right away. I'm not sure I can explain that to you unless you've ever stood at the edge of something you knew would change your life. I needed a minute with him first. So I sat on his floor in the firelight and let myself remember. My father taught me the land before he taught me anything else. He'd kneel beside me on the tundra and put my small hand flat on the moss and tell me to feel how old it was. When I was 9, he caught me carving my initials into a birch, and he didn't yell. He just asked me whose tree it was. Ours, I said. He shook his head slow. The land isn't ours to spend, he told me. We're only keeping it warm for the ones who come after. I rolled my eyes the way 9-year-olds do, but the words went in and stayed, the way the important ones always do. He was a Nupiaq, raised up in the Kobuk before he came south for work, and he carried his country with him like a second spine. He wasn't a mystic about it. He was a practical man who believed that you don't sell what was lent to you. Sitting there, 34 years old and freshly broke and freshly dumped, I understood that this cabin and the ground it stood on were the last of him I had left. Dale could keep his mansion. I had this. And whatever my father had hidden under that floor, He'd left it for me, the one who'd actually come. I set my tea down. I found a flat bar in his toolkit, and I pried up the board. The space beneath was lined with cedar to keep out the damp, dry as a bone after a hard winter. Inside lay a roll of oilcloth, tied with waxed cord, longer than my forearm and heavy when I lifted it. My hands weren't quite steady on the knots. When the cloth fell open across the floor, I forgot to breathe. It was survey work. My father's survey work. But not the casual notes of a man who'd once worked a trade. This was decades of it. Topographic sheets layered over geological overlays, hand-inked, cross-referenced, dated in his blocky print going back nearly 40 years. Drill site notations, sample tags, elevation lines drawn so fine they looked machine-made, though I knew his hand had made every one. I'm a surveyor. I have read 10,000 maps. I had never seen a private citizen produce anything like this. He had mapped the entire section around the cabin and a good deal beyond it, and he'd done it in secret, season after season, while everyone thought he was just an old man who liked the bush. Tucked into the center of the roll was a sealed envelope, the paper gone soft with age and cold. Across the front, in his hand, for the one who comes to look. Not for Dale, not for Mom. For whoever cared enough to make the trip. My eyes kept catching on a name stamped in the corner of one overlay, a geological assay firm out of Anchorage, and a string of coordinates that repeated across a dozen sheets, circled, underlined, returned to again and again, like a question he couldn't stop asking. I didn't open the envelope yet. I wasn't ready, but I knew I was looking at the work of a man who'd found something. I spread the maps across the floor and worked them the way I'd work a job, and what I found pulled the warmth right out of the room. My father hadn't just mapped the land, he'd sampled it. Those drill site notations weren't decoration. They were a methodical grid of core samples, each one logged with depth and date, and a shorthand I'd seen him use my whole life. And against a half dozen of them he'd marked symbols I knew from my own training, the marks a surveyor makes when the ground gives back more than dirt. Mineralization, heavy concentration. He'd circled a formation that ran beneath the creek and out under the spruce flats, and beside it he'd written a single word, pressed so hard the pen had nearly torn the paper. Confirm. Below that, a later date, and one more word. Confirmed. I sat back on my heels. The smart, careful, secretive work of 40 years was telling me one thing in a voice I couldn't pretend not to hear. There was something valuable under my father's worthless shack. Something he'd known about and told no one, not Dale, who'd have sold his own grandmother for a down payment. Not Marcus, who'd sniff out money like a dog. Not even my mother, as far as I could tell. He'd carried this alone, into the dark, every winter, and then he'd built a clause into a trust that pushed it into the hands of whichever child would come north to look. I picked up the sealed envelope. The wax was cracked with age. For the one who comes to look, it said, and my own name wasn't on it, and somehow that made it heavier. I slid my thumb under the flap and broke it open. I didn't get to read it. The satellite phone in my pack started buzzing across the floor, loud as a chainsaw in that silence, and I nearly came out of my skin. Only a handful of people had that number. I answered, and it was Dale, and his voice was wrong from the first word. Too warm, too interested. A salesman's voice. Hey sis, just checking you got home okay from Fairbanks. Dale had never once checked whether I got home okay. I'm fine, I said. There was a pause with weight in it. You're not still up at that cabin, are you? He asked, casual as a man stepping on a trap. I told him I was running errands. I don't know why I lied except that 40 years of my father's secrecy had crawled into my blood the second I opened that roll of cloth. "Vivian thinks you went up there looking for something," Dale said, and laughed like it was a joke. I told her, "What's to look for in a shack?" I kept my voice flat and bored. I said there was nothing up there but mice and old maps, and that was true enough to pass. He let it go too quickly. When he hung up, I sat there with the dead phone in my hand and felt the cold settle deeper than the weather. Because my brother in Miami, who hadn't called me on my birthday in 9 years, had just called me twice in 1 week. Somebody, somewhere, had heard something. I looked down at the open envelope in my other hand. My father's letter half slid out of it, and I understood that whatever was about to come for me, I'd better read his words before it arrived. In the morning, I heard dogs. I stepped out into a hard blue cold and watched a team come up the creek, and behind it stood a man I hadn't seen since I was a teenager. Joe Anixwak had run trap lines with my father for 50 years. He was older than the spruce, it seemed, and he climbed off the sled and looked at me a long moment before he spoke. "You came," he said, like it answered a question he'd been carrying. He'd seen the smoke from my stove and come to check. Inside, over coffee, he warmed his hands and looked at the map still spread across the floor and didn't act surprised. "Sam talked about this ground his whole life," Joe said. "Used to tell me it wasn't for selling. Said some things you keep, you don't spend." It was the same thing my father told me on the tundra when I was 9, almost word for word, and hearing it in another man's mouth made my throat tight. Joe didn't make it mystical. He talked about it like a fact, the way you'd talk about which way a river runs. He told me the people up here had stewarded this country for 10,000 years, that respect for the land wasn't a poem to them, it was the work. Then he looked at me sideways over his cup. "Your dad tested everybody," he said. "Even me. 40 years ago he offered to cut me in on something and watched what I'd do." I asked what he'd done. Joe smiled with about half his teeth. "Told him to keep his secret and pour me more coffee." He set the cup down. "You should read whatever he left you, Bryn, and read it twice. That man never said a thing one time." After Joe left, I finally read my father's letter, and I read it twice like he'd want. It wasn't long. He didn't waste words on paper any more than he did in life. He wrote that if I was reading this, I'd come to the cabin, and that meant I was the kind of person he'd hoped one of his children would turn out to be. He wrote that the land held something, that he'd spent his life confirming it, and would spend the rest of it protecting it. He wrote, "Don't trust the number until you've sat with it. A number that big makes liars out of good people and fools out of the rest." And folded behind the letter was a single page on the letterhead of that Anchorage assay firm, a preliminary report, his name as the client. I'd seen enough geological summaries to read it cold. Grades, tonnage estimates, a formation classification I recognized. My eyes went straight to the bottom of the page where someone had penciled an order of magnitude valuation in the margin, the kind of rough figure a geologist scratches out when a client asks the question everyone asks. My hand started to shake before my brain caught up. I set the page down on the floor, flat, and pressed my palm over it like I could hold the number still. I made myself breathe. Outside, the creek groaned under its ice. Inside, an old man's handwriting was telling me that the worthless shack I'd inherited sat on top of more money than my brother's mansion and Marcus's dead development deal, and every cruel word either of them had ever said to me, combined and tripled and then some. I just hadn't let myself say the figure out loud yet. I was about to. $500 million. That was the number penciled in the margin, and when I finally let myself read it straight, the cabin seemed to tilt around me. I laid the three things out on the floor in a row, side by side, so I'd never be able to tell myself I'd imagined it. The survey roll, 40 years of my father's secret hand, the assay report from Anchorage, grades and tonnage in a stranger's typeface, and the letter, his last words to whichever child came looking. Together they said one impossible thing. Beneath this leaning shack, beneath the creek that groaned all night, beneath the spruce flats my father walked until his knees gave out, lay a body of ore, copper, gold, the rare earths the whole world had started fighting over, that a real survey would likely value near $500 million. I'd inherited the shack. The shack came with the section of land around it, and the land came with what was under it. Dale had his $2.2 million house in the sun, and he was laughing at me, and I was sitting on top of something that could buy his whole zip code and not feel it. But my father's letter wasn't a victory lap. It was a warning. He'd ended it with a line I read a third time, then a fourth, until it was carved into me. What's under this ground could buy the world. That's exactly why no one can ever own it. Not sell it well, not split it fair. No one can ever own it. He'd found the richest thing of his life and decided the right thing to do was make sure it stayed in the ground forever. And he'd left the choice to me, the daughter who came north in a blizzard to a place everyone else threw away. I rolled the maps back up with hands that finally weren't shaking. The number didn't excite me anymore. It scared me, because I already knew what I was going to do, and I knew exactly how many people were going to come try to stop me. I'd be lying if I told you I didn't want it. Anyone who says they'd feel nothing standing on $500 million has never been broke, or dumped, or laughed at across a conference table. That night I let myself want it, all the way, with the fire low and the cold pressing on the windows. I did the math a person does. The money would erase the debt I'd been carrying since I bought my survey equipment. It would buy my mother a house with central heat. It would let me walk into a room where Marcus was and watch him understand exactly what he'd thrown away. It would make Dale, for the first time in his life, the poor one. I sat with all of it. I let it be real. And then I listened to the creek crack under its ice, the way it had cracked under my father's boots for 50 years, and I thought about strip mines. I've surveyed mine sites. I know what a $500 million deposit does to a valley. It doesn't get politely extracted. It gets torn open, drained, poisoned. The creek run orange. The spruce flats scraped to gravel. The caribou gone for good. To cash that number, I'd have to gut the exact ground my father spent his life learning to love. I'd have to spend the thing he told me wasn't ours to spend. So in the morning, I photographed every page, twice, and sealed the originals back under the floor where he'd kept them safe for 40 years. Then I packed my sled. The weather was coming and I had a plane to catch, and 4 hours of road after that. But somewhere over the spruce flats, watching that white country roll out under the wings, I made up my mind. I wasn't going to sell it. I was going to make sure no one ever could. Here's the thing about a secret 40 years deep. It only takes one loose thread to start it unraveling. I found the thread 3 days after I got home to Caribou Bend. A man called my office, friendly, vague, asking whether the Ingram parcel up north was available for any resource discussion. I told him nothing was available and hung up. But the call rattled me because that parcel wasn't public, and its mineral history wasn't either. So I made some calls of my own, the careful kind, and pieced it together. Years back, my father had sent a soil sample to that Anchorage firm under his own name. Firms change hands. Files get bought. Somewhere, a junior analyst doing due diligence on an old archive had flagged the Ingram results, and word of a major formation under private land in the interior had started moving through the small, hungry world of men who chase deposits. One of those men was named Garrett Roth. He represented a resource fund out of Anchorage, and when he finally reached me, he didn't bother being vague. "Ms. Ingram," he said, "I think we both know what your father found." I said I had no idea what he meant. He chuckled, unbothered, a man who'd had this conversation before. "I'll be in Fairbanks next week," he said. "You'll want to talk before this gets complicated." Then he said the thing that turned my stomach to ice. "I've already had a productive conversation with your brother Dale." Of course he had. Dale would have answered Roth's first call like a drowning man grabbing a rope. The two people who'd thrown me away were already shaking hands over the thing I'd inherited. I hung up and sat in my dark office and understood that the easy part was over. Dale called that same night, and the salesman was gone. In his place was the brother I actually grew up with, entitled, certain, and already spending money that wasn't his. He didn't waste time. He said he'd looked into things, and that the trust distribution was starting to look pretty questionable. He said no judge would believe Dad meant to leave his daughter a fortune in minerals, while his son got a depreciating house in a flood zone. Funny how fast a depreciating house in a flood zone became a problem once a frozen shack got interesting. "I'm just saying we should revisit it," Dale said, in the reasonable tone of a man holding a knife. "Keep it in the family, split it fair." I asked him what fair meant. He said 60-40. I asked which way. He laughed, and didn't answer, which was its own answer. I let the silence stretch. Then I said the only thing I'd been saving up since that conference room. "You told me a shack tells me everything, Dale." My voice was level, almost gentle. "It does. Just not what you thought it did." He went quiet for a second, and I heard the moment land. Then he got loud, the way he always got loud when he was losing, and told me his lawyer would be in touch, and that I'd be smart to be reasonable. He hung up on me. 2 days later, a courier brought the paperwork. My brother was contesting the trust on grounds of undue influence, claiming I'd manipulated our parents, that the instrument couldn't be trusted, that the whole distribution should be unwound. He was suing me for the right to help destroy the one thing our father died trying to protect. And the clock that started ticking that morning didn't stop until the day it all came apart. Here's what I learned standing in a freezing cabin with $500 million under my boots. Money doesn't reveal who people are. The smell of it does. Within 1 week, the man who called me worthless wanted me back, and the brother who laughed at my shack wanted half of it. If you've ever watched people change the second you had something they wanted, you already know where this is going. Subscribe, because the turn is close now, and you're going to want to be here for it. Marcus showed up on a Thursday, because of course he did. He came to my office in Caribou Bend with flowers, which he had never once bought me when we were together. He'd driven 4 hours. He stood in my doorway looking handsome and sorry and full of a tenderness that hadn't existed since the day he learned I was poor. "I was awful to you," he said. "I said things I didn't mean. I've been a wreck, Bryn." I let him talk. I'm good at letting people talk. It's amazing what they'll tell you. He got around to it eventually, the way water finds the low ground. He'd heard there might be more to the property than anyone realized. He thought maybe we'd been too hasty. He thought, with his development background and my land, we could do something incredible together. There it was. The whole engagement. In miniature. Me as a parcel to be developed. I looked at the man I'd almost married and felt almost nothing, which surprised me. "A pathetic loser," I said, "with $500 million. He blinked. "What?" "That's your math, isn't it?" I said. "Funny how the number changes what I'm worth to you." His face did a complicated thing. He started to argue, then thought better of it, then offered to help with the legal side, no strings. Marcus, who'd never read a contract that didn't benefit Marcus. I told him I had a lawyer. I told him to take his flowers. And as he drove off, I noticed I wasn't even angry. I was clear. Because a man who tells you who he is when he thinks you have nothing has given you the most useful gift there is. I'd just been too in love to unwrap it the first time. I called Hannah Brower the next morning. She reminded me, the way she had from the first day, that she acted for my parents' trust and could not be my advocate. But she could tell me what Alaska law allowed, and she could point me toward my own counsel to carry it out. So I asked her a question I'd been turning over for a week. If I wanted to make sure this land could never be mined, never be sold, never be split, how would I do it? Legally, so it actually held? She was quiet for a moment. "You're sure," she said. It wasn't a question. "I'm sure." So she walked me through it. Under Alaska law, she said, a landowner can grant a conservation easement, and the state and qualified land trusts can take one by donation, a permanent restriction on the land, recorded against the title, binding every future owner forever. On top of that, I could convey the mineral estate itself into a charitable land trust, separating it from any owner who might be tempted, putting it beyond reach. Once it's recorded, Hannah said, it's presumptively irrevocable. The key is that as of the day those deeds were recorded, you are the record owner of that parcel, with every right to encumber it. The easement and the mineral conveyance run with the land. They bind the ground itself, not just you, so they survive any change in who holds title later. Even if your brother somehow overturned the distribution and took the parcel, he would take it already restricted. And to claw back a recorded charitable donation, he'd have to sue the land trust and the state, not you. And unwinding a completed gift like that faces a very steep bar. She let that settle. So here's what he won't expect. With no profit, no extractable value, no asset left to divide, a trust contest tends to lose its engine. You can't fund 5 years of litigation to win a fortune that no longer exists to fight over. I felt something settle in my chest, hard and certain. My father had spent 40 years documenting the ground so that someone could protect it. He'd left me the maps, the assay, the words. He'd handed me the weapon. But Hannah held up one warning. "It has to be clean," she said. "Your own free choice, fully informed, properly recorded. Rush it or botch it and Roth's people will pull the thread." I told her I don't botch surveys, and I don't. The whole plan rested on one question I had to answer before anything else. Did my family actually own what was under that ground? Surface and minerals don't always travel together in Alaska. The state holds back the mineral estate on a lot of land, and plenty of an heir's dream has died on that single technicality. So I did what I do best. I pulled the chain of title on the cabin parcel and read it back 40 years, document by document, the way you'd read tree rings. And there it was, in my father's foresight again. He'd patented the parcel decades earlier, before the federal patent moratorium closed that door in the 90s, and he'd taken it with the mineral estate intact. Surface and subsurface, both, in the family's name, clean. He hadn't just found the deposit. He'd locked up the legal right to it, quietly, before anyone else knew there was anything to lock up. I sat in my office surrounded by old plats and felt a strange grief, because every smart thing I uncovered was one more thing he'd done alone, in silence, for years, never telling a soul. The records were scattered across 3 different recording districts and a state archive, and half of them were a mess. So I rebuilt the file myself, clean and complete, the way I'd hand it to a client. By the time I finished, I had an airtight package, clear title, intact minerals, full documentation. I was ready to convey it into permanent protection. And that's exactly when I learned Roth had moved first. He'd filed a notice of interest against the parcel. No legal weight, just sand in the gears. A flag to scare off any trust or attorney from touching it. He was trying to freeze me in place. He didn't know how fast I could move. Garrett Roth flew up to Fairbanks and asked to meet, and I went, because I wanted to see the man's face. He was exactly what I expected. Expensive coat, soft hands, a smile that had closed 100 deals over kitchen tables in towns like mine. He bought me coffee I didn't drink and slid a single sheet of paper across the table. The number on it was the kind of number that ends arguments. An outright purchase of the mineral rights, life-changing money, more than I'd make in 10 lifetimes of surveying. Your father was a romantic, Roth said gently, like he was doing me a kindness. You don't have to be. Take the money, Ms. Ingram. Buy your mother that house. It unsettled me how much he knew. Then the velvet came off. Or don't, he said, still smiling. And spend the next 5 years in litigation with my fund and your brother both, watching this eat your business and your savings, until you settle anyway for a fraction. I've seen how this goes. I always have time. People like you never do. I'll tell you the truth. I was scared. Not of him exactly, but of the years he was describing. The slow grind of being outspent by people who treat lawsuits like weather. For a second, the easy road looked very wide. Then I thought of the creek going orange, and my father on his knees on the tundra, and a 9-year-old's hand flat on the moss. I stood up and buttoned my coat. Thank you for the coffee, I said, and that was all. But driving home through the dark, I did the cold arithmetic he'd handed me. He could outlast me in court. So I couldn't let it get to court. I had to record the protection before any of them could freeze the ground beneath my feet. Vivian called me late one night, and for the first hour I almost forgave her for everything. My sister-in-law had never liked me, and I'd never blamed her. She married into a family that runs cold, and she'd spent 15 years trying to keep Dale's various ships from sinking. But that night, her voice was stripped bare. She wasn't performing. We're going to lose the house, she said. Not the Alaska thing. Our house. The kids' school called about tuition. She told me about the flips that had gone bad, the credit lines maxed out, the lifestyle that had quietly become a costume they couldn't afford to stop wearing. You don't know what it's like, she said, and she was crying. To lie to your own children about money every single morning. And I didn't. I sat in the dark and felt the pull of it, the human ache underneath all that greed. For a moment they weren't villains. They were just people who'd built a life out of paper and watched it catch fire. Then Vivian wiped her nose and her voice changed, and the soft moment closed like a door. So you understand why Dale can't back down, she said. He'll take this all the way, Bryn, to the wall. He doesn't have a choice. It wasn't a confession anymore. It was a threat wearing a confession's clothes. I told her I was sorry for her kids and I meant it. I told her I wasn't going to fund their school by gutting my father's land, and I meant that too. When I hung up, I understood the shape of what I was facing more clearly than ever. These people were not cartoon evil. They were desperate, and desperate people don't quit. They escalate. So I called Hannah and told her to file. Now. The decision wasn't really a decision by then. It was just the moment I stopped looking for another way out and accepted that my father had picked the right kid. I sat down with Hannah and we built it carefully, because careful was the whole game. We drafted a conservation easement permanently restricting the land. No extraction, no subdivision, no sale for development, recorded against the title to bind every owner who'd ever come after me. We drafted a conveyance of the mineral estate into a charitable land trust. with a partner organization that worked alongside the regional native corporation, so the protection would have teeth and stewards, both. To shut the door on Dale's undue influence claim, I gathered the proof of intent. The trust that predated all of this by years, drafted by independent counsel. Joe's sworn statement about my father's lifelong refusal to sell, and the letter, in Dad's own hand, telling whoever came north that the ground was never ours to spend. No manipulation. Just a daughter executing a dead man's documented wish. The night before we filed, I sat alone in my office with my father's brass compass in my palm, turning it over and over, watching the needle swing north no matter how I held it. I thought about him out there in the Kobuk dark, missing, maybe gone, and I felt the old grief and a new, fierce love braided together. Then I picked up the pen and I signed every page myself. No one made the choice for me. No fortune fell into my lap. I read his words one more time before I closed the folder. "We're only keeping it warm," I said out loud to the empty room, "for the ones who come after." Hannah told me the recording would clear in a matter of days if no one stopped us first. I didn't sleep. But for the first time all winter, I wasn't afraid. I was ready. Dale's lawyer demanded a settlement meeting, and the timing told me everything. They wanted everyone in one room, me, Dale, the lawyers, all interested parties, to pressure me into a deal before I could do anything irreversible. The letter even hinted that if I refused to attend, they'd seek an order to freeze the parcel pending litigation. They thought the meeting was their move. They didn't know it was mine. Because by the time that room filled up, I intended for the recording to already be done. Hannah and I gamed the calendar down to the hour. The conveyances went to the recorder's office 2 days before the meeting. Recording isn't instant. There's a queue, a clerk, a stamp. And those 2 days were the longest of my life. I jumped every time my phone rang, certain it was Roth's people with some new filing, some injunction, some clever sand thrown in the gears. None came. They were all so busy planning to corner me in a conference room that no one thought to check whether the quiet surveyor from Caribou Bend had simply gone to the courthouse first. The night before the meeting, the call came from Hannah. "It's done," she said, "recorded and indexed. The easement and the mineral conveyance are both on the title. Bryn. It's permanent." I sat very still and let the words settle into my bones. The land my father loved was protected forever, and there was nothing. No lawsuit, no fund, no brother, no offer that could touch it now. I picked up the compass one more time. The needle held north. In the morning, I'd drive to Fairbanks and walk into a room full of people who thought they were about to take everything from me, carrying a single folder. And I'd let them talk first. I always let them talk first. The conference room was the same kind of room where this whole thing started. Bad carpet and worse coffee. Except this time I walked in last and I walked in calm. They were all there. Dale in another thin coat, jaw tight. A lawyer in a gray suit beside him with a stack of motions squared on the table. Vivian, not crying now, eyes hard. Marcus, who had no legal reason to be there at all, lounging against the wall like a man who'd come to watch a show he'd bought tickets for. And Roth, in the corner, expensive and patient, with 2 associates and a checkbook I could practically smell. Hannah took the chair next to mine and set down her briefcase. I set down one folder. That was all I had. One folder, against their wall of paper. I could feel them read it as weakness. I let them. My father taught me that the calmest person in any room is usually the one holding the thing everyone else is afraid of, and I had spent my whole life learning to be calm. Dale's lawyer cleared his throat and began, smooth and rehearsed, laying out their theory of the case. Undue influence, A vulnerable elderly couple, a scheming younger daughter who'd isolated her parents and engineered a distribution to seize a hidden fortune. He used the word fortune 4 or 5 times, savoring it, building toward the number like it was the prize at the bottom of a cereal box. Roth nodded along. Marcus smirked. Vivian watched me with something between hope and hatred. And I sat there with my hands folded on a single folder, the recorded deed inside it, and I let the lawyer finish his entire performance. Then I asked, very quietly, if I could say one thing before we continued. They didn't let me say it. Not yet. They wanted their swings first, and I let them have them, because people who are about to lose everything deserve the dignity of their last good moment. Dale leaned forward. "You think you're so much better than us," he said, the old wound right there in his voice, the 7-year-old still mad about something nobody remembered. "Dad always loved the land more than he loved his own kids, and you're just like him. Cold." His lawyer touched his arm to quiet him, but Dale shook it off. Marcus took his turn from the wall. "I could testify, you know," he said, lazy and cruel. "About your state of mind. You weren't stable after the breakup, Bryn. People saw it." There was no people. There was no breakup that he didn't cause. But he said it smooth. And I understood he'd say it under oath just as smooth, and felt the last thread of feeling for him go quiet and cold. Roth didn't raise his voice. Men like Roth never do. He simply slid a check across the table, face up, the number doing his talking. "We can make all of this disappear today," he said. "Everyone walks away whole. Your brother's debts, your legal fees, your mother's house. One signature." And Vivian, last, leaned in with her eyes wet again, real this time. "Think about my children, Bryn," she whispered. "Please. They didn't do anything to you." For a moment the whole room pressed on me at once. The contempt, the threat, the money, the plea. 4 kinds of pressure aimed at one quiet woman with one folder. It would have broken a lot of people. I'd been broken before, in this exact kind of room, and I remembered how it felt. So I knew, sitting there, that I was not going to break this time. I uncrossed my hands. I opened the folder, and I started to speak. "There's nothing here for any of you to fight over," I said. "There hasn't been for 2 days. You just didn't check." I slid the first document into the middle of the table, turned so they could read it, the recorder's stamp bright in the corner. "This is a conservation easement on the cabin parcel, granted by donation, recorded against the title. It permanently prohibits mining, extraction, subdivision, and development. Forever. It binds me, and it binds every owner who ever comes after me." Roth's smile didn't move, but his eyes did. I slid the second document beside it. "This is a conveyance of the entire mineral estate into a charitable land trust, with the Regional Native Corporation as a steward. As of 2 days ago, I don't own the minerals. No one does, in the way you mean. They can't be bought, sold, or pulled out of the ground. Not by me, not by you, not by anyone." The room had gone very quiet. Dale's lawyer picked up the first page, read it, set it down, and didn't pick up the second. He understood. I turned to Dale and I kept my voice as level as the floor my father planed. "You're contesting a trust to win a fortune that no longer exists. The restriction is recorded against the land itself. Win or lose your case, it binds whoever ends up holding the deed. There's nothing under that ground you can reach. You'd spend 5 years and everything you have left to inherit a frozen creek you're not allowed to touch." I let that sit. Then I looked at Roth. "Your notice of interest is against a parcel that can never be developed. It's worthless now, exactly the way my father wanted it." And finally I looked at my brother, and I gave him back his own words, gentle as I could make them, because cruelty was never the point. You told me a shack tells me everything, Dale. It did. You just never once asked what it was trying to tell you. Nobody spoke. The check still lay on the table facing the ceiling, suddenly the smallest thing in the room. That's when the room came apart, and I sat in the middle of it like a stone in a river. Dale stood up so fast his chair hit the wall. You gave it away? He shouted. $500 million and you gave it to a trust? Are you insane? That was ours. His face was red, his voice cracking, 15 years of resentment and debt and panic pouring out at once. His lawyer was packing his briefcase, already gone in every way that mattered. Roth simply stood, buttoned his coat, collected his check, and walked out without a word. The way a man leaves a table when the game is over and there's no point being angry at the cards. Marcus came off the wall sputtering about lawyers, about fraud, about how I'd thrown away the best thing that ever happened to me. I looked at him then, and I said the last thing I'll ever say to him, calm as still water. You were right about one thing, Marcus. I am exactly what I deserve. I let him start to smile. I just don't think it means what you hoped. His smile died. Vivian was crying again, but quietly now, the fight gone out of her, a woman watching the last lifeboat row away. I felt sorry for her. I'll always feel a little sorry for her. But I didn't owe her my father's valley, and I never would. I gathered my one folder, slid my chair in neat, and stood. Dale was still shouting something behind me about ungrateful and selfish and exactly what Dad would have wanted. I didn't turn around. I'd said everything I came to say, and I'd said all of it without raising my voice once. I put my hand on the door, and right then, before I could push it open, the door opened from the other side. My father walked into the room, and my mother walked in behind him. Both of them sunburned and thinner and very much alive. The shouting stopped like a switch had been thrown. Dale made a sound I'd never heard him make. I just stood there with my hand still on the door, looking at the man I'd half buried in my heart all winter, feeling the floor go strange under me again. They'd come down from the Kobuk a week ago, my father said later, the moment the rivers opened. They'd been watching. They'd pieced together the rest the way you reconstruct a winter you weren't there for. From Joe, and from the trust file Hannah had kept, the file she'd told me from the first day belonged to my parents' instrument and not to me. She had administered their signed plan to the letter, the way she was bound to, never once knowing whether the silence on the Kobuk meant a test or a grave. Because the whole thing, the off-grid winter, the silence, the cruel lopsided distribution, the trigger clause that forced a frozen shack into one child's hands and a fortune in the sun into the other's. All of it had been built. A test. My father looked older and unbearably calm, and he said it plainly to the whole stunned room. I found the richest thing of my life 40 years ago, he said, and I spent 40 years deciding which of my children I could trust to leave it in the ground. Now I know. Then Hannah spoke for the first time and told the room the thing my father had folded into the same instrument that none of us had seen, a backstop, a standing direction that the moment anyone moved to sell or mine that parcel, the mineral estate would divert into the land trust on its own, beyond reach. The land had never truly been at risk. Only we had. He hadn't gambled his life's work on me guessing right. He'd made certain the ground was safe no matter which of us failed him, and then he'd watched to see who would protect it without a net, never knowing one was there. His eyes found me. And I want to tell you I melted, that it was a perfect reunion, that I forgave it all on the spot. I didn't. Because here is the thing they hadn't counted on. I'd already protected the land. I'd recorded the easement 2 days before they walked through that door. I passed his test before he was even there to grade it, which meant I hadn't done it for his approval, or his fortune, or to win anything from anyone. I'd done it because it was right. So when he opened his arms, I didn't run into them. I looked my father dead in the eye, this man I loved more than my own breath, and I said, "You let me think you were dead, to see if I'd sell your grave." I passed. But you don't ever get to test love, Dad. Not mine. Not again. The fallout was quiet, the way real consequences usually are. Dale dropped the lawsuit within the month, because his lawyer told him what I already knew. The restriction ran with the land no matter who won, and you can't win a fight over a fortune that no longer exists. The legal fees he'd run up chasing it were his to keep. Last I heard, the Miami house went on the market to cover them. Marcus's development deal collapsed on its own schedule, with no rescue coming from me or anyone, and he stopped calling once the math stopped working in his favor. Roth flew back to Anchorage and found some other valley to want. And the land, my father's land, the creek and the spruce flats, and the $500 million sleeping in the dark beneath it, stayed exactly where it was, protected forever, stewarded by people who measure wealth in caribou and clean water instead of dollars. Part of it opened for subsistence use and study, the way Dad always wanted. My parents and I started the slow work of being a family again. I didn't forgive the test quickly, and I made them earn their way back, conversation by hard conversation. But my father would sit on my porch in the long light and tell me I'd done the one thing he'd hoped for, and some nights, that was enough. Vivian and I never became friends. I sent her kids' school a quiet check anyway, once, with no name on it. Some things you keep, some things you don't spend. He taught me both. I set new lines after that, and I held them. With my parents, the line was simple. I told them I'd love them for the rest of my life, and that they would never test me again, and I watched my father nod like a man accepting a fair sentence. With Dale, the line was distance. I wished him well, and I stopped answering the calls that only came when he needed something. I'd spent 34 years being the one who carried the family, the one who fixed it, the one you could always count on to absorb the blow. I was done being the shock absorber for people who only remembered me when I was useful. I went back to Caribou Bend and reopened my survey office, but I added something new to the shingle. Now, alongside the boundary lines and the plat work, I help other people protect their land the way I protected my father's. Conservation easements, mineral conveyances, the careful paperwork that keeps a place from being spent. The creek behind my house still groans all night under its ice. I sleep better than I have in years. My father didn't leave me a fortune. He left me a question. What are you willing to protect when no one is watching and no one will ever pay you for it? And the only way to pass was to answer it before anyone could reward me for the answer. That's my story. A broken cabin, a brother who counted my worth in dollars, and a man who called me a loser before he ever knew what I was standing on. If someone